April 12, 1943. A German Bf-109 pilot from Jagdgeschwader 52 is climbing through 2,000 meters above the Kuban steppe when his radio crackles. What comes through is not a tactical instruction. It is not a target bearing or a weather warning. It is a name. One name repeated twice, transmitted in the clear by a forward observation post on the ground. Achtung. Pokryshkin. Achtung. Pokryshkin. The pilot has heard this name before. Every pilot in his Gruppe has heard it. 3 days ago, on April 9th, a Soviet P-39 Aerocobra had appeared over Krimskaya and destroyed a Bf-109 in a single burst of cannon fire on its very first pass. The pilot who fired that burst was Pokryshkin. Today, April 12th, he will shoot down 4 more German fighters before noon. The Bf-109 pilot banking away from the area does not know the final count yet. He only knows the name, and the name is enough. This is where the story of the P-39 Aerocobra on the Eastern Front actually begins. Not in a factory in Buffalo, New York, where Bell aircraft engineers drew up their unconventional design. Not in Britain, where RAF test pilots flew it once, filed a report recommending it be scrapped entirely and never flew it again. Not in the United States, where American pilots called it the Iron Dog and requested transfers to anything else. The story begins here, above the Kuban River in the spring of 1943, with a German pilot turning his aircraft around because a Soviet ace had just entered his airspace, and with a name that would become the most unusual military warning broadcast on any front in the entire war. To understand what Pokryshkin did to the Luftwaffe over the Kuban, you first need to understand what the Luftwaffe expected in the spring of 1943. Jagdgeschwader 52 was the finest fighter unit in the German Air Force by any measure that mattered. Confirmed kills, operational experience, pilot quality. Its roster included men who had been flying combat since Spain in 1936. Its kill counts were staggering. On the Eastern Front since 1941, JG-52 had grown accustomed to a particular rhythm. Soviet pilots were brave, sometimes individually skilled, but they flew in rigid formations, used outdated tactics, and died in quantities that suggested the Red Air Force had not yet fully absorbed the lessons of modern air combat. By 1943, that assumption was wrong, and one man above all others had made it wrong. Alexander Pokryshkin was 29 years old, born in Novosibirsk, the son of a factory worker. He had learned to fly in a civilian flying club by working nights and weekends to pay for the lessons himself. He had been flying combat since the first day of the German invasion in June 1941, and almost from that first day he had been writing things down. Not orders, not reports, observations. He kept notebooks from the beginning of the war, filling them with analysis of every engagement he witnessed or participated in. Who died and why? Who survived and why? What the Bf-109 did in a turning fight at low altitude versus a climbing fight at altitude. What happened when a Soviet pilot broke left versus breaking right. What the German escort fighter did when the bombers it was protecting came under attack from below. He wrote it all down, argued about it with anyone who would argue back, and gradually built something that no Soviet pilot had yet assembled in a systematic way. A complete tactical doctrine for fighting the Luftwaffe at low altitude, built from actual data rather than pre-war theory. His superiors did not uniformly appreciate this. In 1942, a regimental commander named Isayev attempted to have Pokryshkin court-martialed for openly criticizing official tactics. The same official tactics that Pokryshkin had documented with evidence were getting Soviet pilots killed at a rate that was mathematically unsustainable. The case was dismissed. Pokryshkin was reinstated. Isayev's tactics continued to be official doctrine, and Soviet pilots continued to die following them. But Pokryshkin kept writing. By the time he received his first P-39 Airacobra in early 1943, his notebooks contained something that the entire Soviet Air Force command structure had failed to produce in 2 years of catastrophic war. A working answer to the question of how to fight the Bf-109 and win consistently. The answer was 4 words. He drilled them into every pilot under his command until the sequence was automatic. Altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, not simultaneously, in sequence. First, you gain altitude, not because height is comfortable, but because height is stored energy. Then you convert that altitude into speed by diving. The dive gives you kinetic force that no engine can produce from a standing start. A P-39 in a dive from 3,000 meters is faster than anything the Luftwaffe is flying in level flight at the same altitude, regardless of what the engineering specifications say. Then you use that speed for the maneuver. The precise positioning that puts the enemy aircraft inside 200 meters and directly in front of you, where the 37mm cannon becomes not a weapon but a guarantee. Then, and only then, you fire. 1 burst, 2 at most. The cannon carried 30 rounds per mission, and every round had to mean something. Here is what 37mm means in practical terms. The Bf-109G's airframe from wingtip to wingtip was just under 10 meters. The cannon round that Pokryshkin fired through the propeller hub of his P-39 weighed more than half a kilogram. When it hit a Bf-109, it did not damage the aircraft. It did not wound it. At close range, a single hit to the engine, the cockpit, or the wing root simply removed that section of the aircraft from existence. German pilots who survived engagements with Pokryshkin and his regiment, and who were captured in subsequent months, described the cannon's effect on their colleagues' aircraft in language that stopped being clinical very quickly. The Luftwaffe began noticing the pattern in late April. Not just the kills. Kills were expected. Losses were normal. Every unit sustained them. What the intelligence officers were tracking was the signature. Every engagement that came back as a total loss, no damaged aircraft, no partial returns, just clean destructions, was associated with the same unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, and increasingly with the same pilot. The cannon bursts were precise in a way that suggested not instinct but calculation. Someone on the Soviet side was treating air combat as an applied mathematics problem and getting the arithmetic right almost every time. On April 29, 1943, the calculation produced its most dramatic result. Soviet ground radar tracked a large German formation moving toward the Kuban bridgehead. 3 full squadrons of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers escorted by Bf-109 fighters. A strike package whose mission was to destroy Soviet ground positions and whose destruction, if it could be achieved, would represent a serious blow to German operations in the sector. The force available to intercept it was 8 P-39's Airacobras, 8 against 3 squadrons. The mathematics under any conventional reading were not in the Soviets' favor. Pokryshkin did not use a conventional reading. He split his 8 aircraft into altitude tiers, pairs stacked at different heights, each with a specific task in the engagement. 2 aircraft to engage the Bf-109 escort at altitude and hold its attention. 6 aircraft to execute sequential diving attacks through the Stuka formation, each pair diving from a different angle, converting altitude into speed, pulling away before the escort could respond, then climbing back to altitude to repeat. The formation had a name, the bookshelf. Every shelf had a function. No shelf interfered with another. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. 12 German aircraft were shot down. Not a single P-39 was lost. Pokryshkin himself was officially credited with 2 kills. Accounts from his own pilots and from German records of the day's losses suggest the actual number he destroyed was 5. When the German intelligence summary of April 29th was compiled, it described the engagement in terms noticeably different from standard loss reports. The formation had been defeated not by superior numbers or surprise, but by a tactical system, a coordinated method that had anticipated German responses and structured the Soviet attack to neutralize them before they could develop. Someone had planned this. The planning was visible in the execution, and the man at the center of it, flying his own P-39 into the Stuka formation and pulling the trigger on 5 separate passes, was the same name that had been appearing in incident reports since April 9th. The Luftwaffe's response was unprecedented. Forward observation posts and radar stations along the Kuban front were issued a specific standing instruction. When Pokryshkin's aircraft was identified, broadcast the warning immediately on all tactical frequencies. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not route it through normal channels. Broadcast it now in the clear and plain language so that every German pilot in the air could hear it. Achtung! Achtung! Pokryshkin ist in der Luft. This decision deserves a moment of consideration because it was not a small one. The Luftwaffe was an organization built on the principle that its pilots were the finest in the world. Its training system, its unit culture, its entire institutional identity rested on the assumption of German air superiority. Not just technological superiority, but the superiority of the individual pilot, the professional, the expert. Broadcasting a single Soviet pilot's name as a danger warning to be transmitted fleet-wide was an act that carried an institutional cost. It was an admission. It said in 5 words that there was a man in the air on the other side who was dangerous enough to require a special protocol that existed for no other individual in the entire war. German pilots heard it and made decisions. Not all of them turned back. Some pressed on, some engaged, some died. But documented accounts from Soviet pilots in Pokryshkin's regiment describe multiple occasions when German formations visibly altered course after the warning went out. Pokryshkin knew the Germans were monitoring his radio traffic because the warning was transmitted on frequencies his own ground controllers used. He knew when they heard his call sign, Sotka, 100. On 2 documented occasions while escorting Soviet P-2 bombers, he broke radio silence and transmitted openly on the common frequency. Vнимание. Ya Sotka. Poedu na robotu. Attention. I am 100. I am going to work. On both occasions, the German fighters that had been tracking the bomber formation did not intercept. They simply were not there when the bombers arrived at the target. He had turned his own name into a weapon that weighed nothing, used no ammunition, and worked without him even needing to take off. By the end of May 1943, Pokryshkin had 20 confirmed kills over the Kuban alone. His regiment had destroyed more German aircraft in 6 weeks than some Soviet air divisions had managed in 6 months. And somewhere in the Luftwaffe's intelligence apparatus, a request was being drafted. A request for a captured P-39-era Cobra, intact if possible, or as close to intact as the Eastern Front allowed, to be transported west and taken apart by engineers who needed to understand what this aircraft was actually doing down there at low altitude that was producing results the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine said should be impossible. The aircraft that would answer that request was already out there, somewhere above the burning steppe. It just did not know yet that it was going to be captured. Here is a fact that should not be possible. The most dangerous fighter aircraft on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1943 was a plane that the United States Air Force had rejected, that the Royal Air Force had tested, filed a report on, and quietly removed from service after 1 deployment. That American pilots flying it in the Pacific had given it a nickname, the Iron Dog, and requested transfers to anything else. A plane that Bell Aircraft's own sales team had trouble defending in procurement meetings because the performance numbers at high altitude were simply not competitive with anything else being built in 1943. That aircraft was currently killing the best pilots in Jagdgeschwader 52 at a rate that had prompted the Luftwaffe to do something it had never done before and would never do again for any other individual on any front in the entire war. And nobody on the German side yet understood why. September 22, 1943. Rechlin, northern Germany. The Luftwaffe's primary technical evaluation facility sits on the southern shore of the Müritz Lake, and on this particular morning Oberingenieur Hans Mertens is standing in Hangar 7 watching a flatbed rail wagon being unloaded. The aircraft on the wagon has been partially disassembled for transport. The wings are off, the tail surfaces are detached, the fuselage is wrapped in tarpaulins that are stiff with the dried mud of a Cuban marsh. The Soviet red stars on the fuselage are still visible beneath the mud, bright enough to be unsettling in the gray northern light. Mertens has evaluated captured enemy aircraft before. He has spent time with a Hurricane, a Spitfire, a P-40. Each of them taught him something. None of them had given him the feeling he is getting now, standing in the hangar doorway watching the tarpaulins come off, which is the feeling that he does not yet know what question to ask. The first thing that stops him is the door. Not a canopy, not a hatch. A door, rectangular, solid, hinged at the front, opening outward from the cockpit like the door of an automobile. Mertens stands in front of it for a moment that his assistant will later describe as the longest he had ever seen the Oberingenieur spend not writing in his notebook. Then Mertens opens the door. It swings on its hinge with a solidity and precision that a Berlin car manufacturer would be proud of. The latch engages cleanly. There is no play, no looseness, no compromise in the fitting. He closes it, opens it again, closes it. Then he picks up his notebook and writes one sentence. This door exists because of something specific about this aircraft's interior layout. Find out what. What he finds over the following days dismantles every assumption his team brought into the hangar. In every fighter aircraft in the world in 1943, the engine sits in the nose. The logic behind this is so obvious that it had ceased to be logic and become furniture. The kind of assumption that nobody examines because examining it would feel faintly absurd. The engine drives the propeller. The propeller needs to be at the front. Therefore, the engine goes in the front. This is simply what aircraft are. The P-39 Aerocobra's engine is not in the nose. When Mertens' team removes the rear fuselage access panels, they find the Allison V-1710 engine sitting behind the cockpit where a second seat would be in a trainer. The propeller is at the front of the aircraft. The engine is in the middle. Connecting them, running forward through the cockpit floor under the pilot's seat and between his feet, is a drive shaft. A precision-machined steel rod nearly 3 meters long, spinning at engine speed, transmitting power forward to a reduction gearbox in the nose. Through the hollow center of that gearbox. Through the hollow hub of the propeller itself. The barrel of a 37mm cannon. Mertens' team spends an entire afternoon measuring the drive shaft. Not because measurement is difficult, because the tolerances required to spin this shaft at this speed across this distance without catastrophic vibration are so precise that his senior machinist, a man who has been working metal for 30 years, looks up from his calipers and says quietly that he is not certain the Rechlin facility could manufacture a replacement. That evening, Mertens writes in his evaluation journal, Bell Aircraft solved a precision engineering problem that we have not been required to solve. The question is what they bought with it. By the fourth day, the answer is becoming clear in a way that Mertens finds professionally unsettling. He is not a man who is easily unsettled. He has evaluated enough aircraft to know that every design is a set of trade-offs, and that the trade-offs other nations accept are always instructive about what they value. But the trade-offs in the P-39 are not what he expected. Moving the engine to the center of the aircraft does something specific to the physics. The heaviest single component is no longer at the extreme front, pulling the nose down. The tail surfaces no longer need to generate constant downforce just to keep the aircraft level. The mass is concentrated near the roll axis rather than spread across the length of the fuselage. When a pilot commands a roll, there is almost no rotational inertia resisting the movement. The aircraft responds not with the slight heaviness that every German pilot accepts as normal in a Bf-109, but with an immediacy that Merton's calculations suggest would feel, from the cockpit, like the aircraft is reading the pilot's intention rather than waiting for his input. He calls this finding the central problem, not because the P-39's roll rate is faster than the Bf-109. That alone would be significant but manageable. The central problem is that the P-39's roll rate advantage is largest at low altitude, exactly where Pokryshkin's regiment has been destroying German aircraft all spring. Every engagement report from the Kuban that Mertens has been given describes the same signature. A Soviet P-39 appearing from above, executing a diving attack, rolling through the German formation faster than the escorts could track, and pulling away clean. The aircraft was not performing these maneuvers despite its design. It was performing them because of it. Every piece of the P-39 that the Americans had considered a liability was operating exactly as intended. The cannon installation confirms this completely. Mertens brings in the captured M4 cannon from its separate storage crate and lays it on a workbench beside the technical drawings his team has made. The weapon fires through the propeller hub on the aircraft's precise center line. This means that when the trigger is pulled, the recoil acts directly along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. No sideways force, no yaw, no moment pulling the nose offline at the exact instant the pilot needs it to stay still. He pulls the file on the German board Kanone 37, the Luftwaffe's own 37mm cannon mounted externally under the wings of certain Bf-109 variants. One report from an Eastern Front pilot describes attempting to use the BK-37 in a turning engagement and calls the compensation required in plain language, not compatible with simultaneous target tracking. The Americans had solved this problem before the war started. They had placed the gun on the center line and let physics do the rest. The solution had been in operational service for 2 years. German intelligence had photographs of it. Nobody had followed the photographs to their conclusion. October 9th, 1943. The P-39 has been repaired. 11 days of fabricating replacement parts, patching the forward fuselage with German aluminum, nursing the Allison engine through a startup sequence that nobody at Rechlin had performed before. It sits on the test runway in the thin autumn sunlight, repainted with Luftwaffe crosses over the Soviet red stars. The crosses look wrong. The aircraft resists the new identity with a stubbornness that is obviously inanimate and somehow still noticeable. Hauptmann Felix Dorr climbs in through the automobile door. He is 32 years old. 240 combat hours on the Bf-109 in 3 variants. He has flown captured aircraft before, a Hurricane briefly in 1942, and he approaches foreign cockpits with the methodical calm of a professional who has learned that unfamiliar machinery rewards patience and punishes assumptions. He settles into the seat, adjusts his position, looks forward. The entire runway is visible in front of him, not through a gap above an engine cowling, not by craning sideways around an obstruction. Directly, completely in a straight line from his eyes to the far end of the strip. There is no engine in the way. There is no engine in the nose at all. The view is so unobstructed, so clean that Dorr sits with his hands on the controls for a moment without doing anything. simply absorbing the fact that he can see where he is going. Then he starts the engine. The Allison catches on the third attempt and settles into a sound he has not heard before, deeper and smoother than the Daimler-Benz, less mechanical urgency, as if the engine is making power with less effort than it ought to require. He taxes to the threshold, applies throttle. The aircraft tracks perfectly straight down the center line without the pronounced swing that every tailwheel fighter produces on takeoff, the swing that every Bf-109 pilot corrects with right rudder so automatically that they have stopped noticing they are doing it. At 160 kilometers per hour, the P-39 rises from the runway without drama, without the lurch of rotation, as if the transition between ground and air is a formality rather than a physical event. Door climbs to 2,000 meters, levels off, and rolls, full aileron deflection, left. The aircraft snaps around its longitudinal axis so fast that Door's shoulder hits the side of the cockpit before he has fully processed that the roll has started. He neutralizes the controls. The aircraft stops level instantly. He rolls right. Same result. He does 4 more in quick succession, alternating directions. Feeling the way the aircraft pivots around its own center with a precision that has no equivalent in anything he has flown before. Not better in the way that one good aircraft is better than another good aircraft. Better in a way that suggests a different category of responsiveness entirely. He climbs to 4,000 meters and feels the engine soften, the response slow, the aircraft becoming ordinary. At 5,000 meters it is sluggish and vulnerable and everything the RAF test report said it was. He dives back to 1,500 meters and it becomes something else again. His debrief runs 90 minutes and Mertens transcribes every word. The conclusion Door states at the end is 3 sentences. Below 2,000 meters in a turning engagement, this aircraft is superior to the Bf-109G in roll rate and turn radius. A German pilot who engages a P-39 below 2,000 meters at close range in a turning fight is at a disadvantage that his training did not prepare him for. The pilots who have been dying over the Kuban were not making mistakes. They were flying into a situation the Bf-109 cannot win. Mertens closes his notebook. Outside, the lake is flat and gray in the late afternoon. Inside the hangar, the P-39 sits on its trestles under the working lights, the automobile door closed, the cannon barrel protruding from the nose with its characteristic bluntness. It looks, in this light, patient. Like something that has been waiting a long time to be understood and has now, finally, received the attention it was owed. The evaluation report is finished on October 28th, 67 pages. The summary states the conclusion in one paragraph that Mertens rewrites 4 times until it says exactly what the evidence requires and nothing more. The Bell P-39. Airacobra is not a failed design. It is a specialized weapon, optimized for a specific combat environment that was given to pilots who understood it and used by an air force that had built a doctrine around its strengths. The Luftwaffe has been fighting this aircraft for 6 months without understanding what it is. The report is classified, sealed, and dispatched to Berlin. What Berlin does with it is a different story, and it is not a good one. November 3rd, 1943. Berlin. The Reich Aviation Ministry on Wilhelmstrasse is a building that was designed to communicate that Germany had already won. Enormous stone facades, corridors wide enough to march a formation through, ceilings high enough that the sound of a typewriter reaches them and comes back slightly changed, as if the building itself is editing what is being written inside it. On this morning, a 67-page classified report from Rechlin lands on the desk of Oberst Heinrich Baum. Baum reads the summary on page 3. He reads the operational recommendations. He picks up his telephone and makes a call that will take 6 weeks to produce a result. and the result will be the most expensive kind that a bureaucracy at war can produce. The appearance of action without the substance of it. The word he uses in his response letter to Rechlin is deferred, not rejected, deferred. There is a distinction technically. Retooling the Bf-109 production lines to develop a dedicated low-altitude variant with a modified supercharger cannot be accommodated at the current stage of output. The lines are running at maximum capacity. Stopping them has consequences that reach the front within weeks. The ministry understands the findings. The ministry is taking the matter under advisement. Mertens receives this letter on November 17th, reads it twice, places it in a file, and returns to his next evaluation. He has sent reports before that disappeared into the ministry without visible effect. He is a practical man, and he knows the difference between a genuine response and a deferral dressed in official language. What he does not know, what nobody at Rechlin knows on that gray November evening, is the name of the pilot who will die tomorrow morning because the tactical guidance that should have reached his airfield 2 weeks ago is still somewhere in a distribution queue in Berlin. That pilot is Oberfeldwebel Kurt Heller, 24 years old, from a small town outside Cologne. 31 confirmed kills, 2 years on the Eastern Front without a scratch. On the morning of November 18, 1943, he takes off from a forward airfield near Kirovograd on a routine intercept mission and encounters 2 P-39 Airacobras at 1,400 meters. The engagement lasts 40 seconds. He does what his training tells him to do. He turns into the attack and tries to bring his guns to bear. His training was built for a different aircraft. The one-page tactical summary that would have told him never to do exactly this is on his duty officer's desk, unopened, under 3 other documents that arrived in the same package. His aircraft is found 3 kilometers east of the airfield. The damage to the forward fuselage is consistent with a single burst from a 37mm cannon at close range. He is one of many. He is not a statistic. While Berlin defers and distributes and processes, Alexander Pokryshkin is in the western Ukraine doing something that no official Soviet Air Force program has asked him to do, and no official Soviet Air Force program could have produced. He is teaching, not in a classroom, not through channels that had once tried to court-martial him for independent thinking and might try again if given sufficient cause. He is teaching through the debrief, the post-mission analysis that most units conduct as a 10-minute formality and that Pokryshkin's regiment conducts as the most important hour of the operational day. Every pilot who flew sits down immediately after landing while the details are still immediate and the adrenaline has not yet become fatigue, and walks through every decision he made from takeoff to touchdown. Every moment where the outcome could have gone differently. Every second where he chose correctly and every second where he did not. Pokryshkin leads these sessions himself. He asks questions rather than delivering conclusions because a pilot who has reasoned his way to an answer owns it in the cockpit in a way that a pilot who was simply told the answer does not. He draws diagrams on whatever surface is available. Walls, wooden boards, the backs of supply manifests. His mechanics keep the notebooks. His wingmen copy the diagrams. The knowledge moves through the regiment sideways between people who need it and recognize its value immediately, without waiting for any authority above them to approve its transmission. What this system produces is visible in the numbers by December 1943 in a way that German intelligence analysts flag as anomalous. Pilots arriving in Pokryshkin's regiment as average performers and leaving 3 months later with 12, 15, 18 kills. Kill ratios that cannot be explained by aircraft performance alone. The P-39, which Bell Aircraft had built as a specialized low-altitude weapon with a ceiling on its usefulness, is now generating results that exceed even that specialization. Because Pokryshkin had taken the machine, understood it on its own precise terms, and built a human system around it that multiplied its capabilities by a factor the engineers in Buffalo had never designed for. But the most important thing Pokryshkin teaches his pilots is not a maneuver. It is not a formation. It is a question. The question he had written in his notebooks in 1941 and had never stopped asking since. The question that had nearly gotten him court-martialed because asking it loudly implied that the men who outranked him had not been asking it themselves. The question is, why did that pilot die? Not in the sense of blame, not as an accusation, as an engineering problem. Every death in an air engagement has a cause that is specific, traceable, and preventable the next time if it is understood correctly the first time. Pokryshkin believed this with the intensity of a man whose entire survival had depended on it being true, and his regiment flew and died and survived by the same belief. This is the gap that the 67-page Rechlin report, for all its precision and all its value, could not close. Mertens had understood the P-39's engineering. He had measured every component, calculated every performance characteristic, and written it all down in language that was technically accurate and professionally rigorous. His evaluation was correct in every particular. But correctness filed in a classified document in Berlin is not the same thing as understanding alive in the cockpit of a pilot who needs it in the next 4 minutes. The Focke-Wulf Technical Department receives a copy of the Rechlin report in late November. Kurt Tank's engineers note the center of gravity findings with genuine interest. The weight distribution data from the P-39 evaluation will eventually influence German design thinking in ways that are real, if indirect. Tank is a serious engineer, and serious engineers do not ignore data simply because it came from the enemy. But Tank's projects take years. The aircraft that might carry the lessons of the P-39 evaluation will not reach operational units before 1945. By 1945, the question of what a German fighter can do at low altitude over the Eastern Front will have ceased to be the most urgent problem facing the Reich. December 1943. Pokryshkin has 59 confirmed kills. He is the Soviet Union's leading ace. He has been awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union twice, in a country at war, in a military culture that does not give this honor casually. Twice is an achievement so rare that it draws attention from people who normally do not follow individual pilots. His superiors, some of whom had once sought to remove him from command for the crime of being publicly correct about things they preferred not to examine, are now presenting him as a model for the entire Air Force. They do not always understand the mechanism by which his regiment is producing these results. But they can read the numbers, and the numbers are the kind that end arguments. The war continues for another 18 months after December 1943. Pokryshkin flies 550 combat missions before it ends. He is officially credited with 59 aerial victories. His own accounts and those of his regiment suggest this number is conservative. Soviet confirmation requirements were strict, and Pokryshkin frequently broke off after a kill to re-engage rather than circling to watch the aircraft hit the ground, which was required for official credit. He becomes the first man in Soviet history to receive the Gold Star 3 times. A triple hero. 2 other men receive it during the entire war. After the war ends, historians begin interviewing the survivors. On both sides. The German veterans of JG-52 who had flown against Pokryshkin's regiment are asked in various ways and at various times over the following decades what it had been like. What they describe consistently is not simply a pilot who was better than German pilots, though most of them acknowledge he was. What they describe is a system, a method so completely thought through, so thoroughly tested, and so effectively transmitted to the men flying around him that engaging his regiment felt, In the words of one JG-52 veteran whose interview is cited in multiple post-war histories, like walking into an argument that the other side had already finished having without you. One of those veterans, interviewed in 1971, is asked specifically about the warning. Achtung, Pokryshkin ist in der Luft. He is asked whether pilots actually turned back when they heard it. He is quiet for a moment. Then he says some did. The ones who had been there long enough to know what it meant. He pauses again. The ones who had not been there long enough. They stayed. He does not finish the sentence. He does not need to. The report that Mertens completed on October 28, 1943, 67 pages, every dimension measured, every performance characteristic documented, every recommendation stated with the precision of a man who had spent his career treating accuracy as a form of integrity, was correct. Every word of it was correct. It correctly identified what the P-39 was. It correctly identified why German pilots were dying. It correctly identified what needed to change. It was filed, classified, deferred, and partially distributed across a bureaucracy moving at the speed of paper through a war moving at the speed of cannon fire. The gap between those two speeds is where Kurt Heller died, and the pilots after him, and the ones after them. Pokryshkin had understood something in 1941 that the Reich Aviation Ministry was still processing in 1943. That in a war this fast and this total, the side that learns quickest does not merely gain an advantage, it survives. The side that mistakes the filing of a report for the solving of a problem does not get a second chance to correct the error. The P-39 Airacobra was an aircraft that 3 air forces had rejected as insufficient. One pilot had asked a different question about it, not whether it was good enough, but good enough for what? The answer had taken him 550 missions and 59 confirmed kills to demonstrate completely. The Luftwaffe's answer came in 67 pages and arrived too late.